You will marry Cole Ryder by Friday, Mrs. Calloway, or you will vacate that property by sundown Saturday." Clara didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood in that courtroom with her husband's blood still metaphorically warm in the Wyoming ground, and looked Judge Harlan Pruitt dead in the eye. "My husband built that ranch with his bare hands and died wearing your town's badge, and you're standing here telling me I have to marry a killer to keep it." Pruitt didn't flinch. "I'm telling you the law." Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides. "Then your law is a filthy lie. If this story already has your heart racing, you are exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to this channel, hit that bell, and follow Clara and Cole's story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Clara Calloway had buried her husband on a Tuesday. By Thursday afternoon, she was standing inside a courtroom that smelled like pine resin and old tobacco, wearing the same black dress she'd worn to the grave, and listening to a judge explain why her grief didn't entitle her to her own land. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten anything that morning except half a biscuit that one of her ranch hands, old Pete Dawson, had pressed into her hand before she climbed into the wagon. Pete had said, "You eat that, Mrs. Clara. You're going to need your strength today." He'd looked at her with the kind of pity that made her stomach clench. Pete wasn't a man who pitied easily. That alone should have warned her. But nothing could have prepared her for what Judge Harlan Pruitt laid out across that courtroom like a trap already sprung. The argument was simple, delivered with the calm authority of a man who had rehearsed it. A ranch the size of the Calloway property, 460 acres of prime Wyoming grassland, with water rights along Clearwater Creek, could not, under territorial law, as Pruitt interpreted it, be managed or legally held by a woman without a male head of household. Ethan Calloway had left no will. The property reverted to disputed status. And unless Clara could produce a husband within 7 days, the court would place the property in receivership pending reassignment. Reassignment. She had stood there and watched Pruitt say that word and felt something go cold and still inside her chest. Receivership. Clara repeated, her voice flat. "That's what you're calling it." "That is the legal term, Mrs. Calloway." "And who exactly receives it?" "Judge who's already lined up outside that door with their hand out." Pruitt's expression didn't change. He was a large man, thick through the shoulders, with a face like old saddle leather, creased and weathered and revealing nothing. He had been judge in Clearwater County for 11 years. Clara had never had cause to dislike him before this moment. Now she understood that she'd simply never had cause to look closely enough. "The court will determine appropriate disposition of the property," he said. "That is not your concern. That ranch is every concern I have left in this world. Then you'll want to consider your options carefully." Pruitt clasped his hands on the desk in front of him. "You have until Friday of next week. 7 days. Clara looked around the courtroom. There were 8 men in the gallery. She recognized most of them ranchers, merchants, one deputy who'd served under Ethan. None of them looked at her. Every single one of them found something deeply interesting to study on the floor, on the ceiling, on their own hands. She understood then that this had been decided before she walked through the door. "And the man?" she asked. "You already have someone in mind, don't you?" It wasn't a question. Pruitt knew it wasn't a question. "The town council has identified a candidate willing to enter the arrangement," he said carefully. "A man of suitable capability for managing a property of that size and its associated risks." "Capability," she said. "That's a polite word for it." Cole Ryder. The name landed in this courtroom like a stone dropped into still water, and Clara watched the ripple move through every man in that gallery. Shoulders tightened. Breath was held. Deputy Walsh, who had served under Ethan for 6 years and eaten at her table at least a dozen times, pressed his lips together and stared at his boots so hard she thought he might burn a hole through the leather. Clara knew the name. Everyone in Clearwater County knew the name. Cole Ryder was the kind of man whose reputation arrived in a town 3 days before he did, riding ahead of him like a bad wind. Gunfighter. Drifter. A man who'd ridden with military scouts during the war and come out the other side of that experience carrying something dark and permanent behind his eyes. He'd been in Clearwater for 4 months, working occasional ranch labor, sleeping at the edge of town, in a room at the Deacon's boarding house, speaking to almost no one. He was 34 years old, and he had the face of a man 20 years older, not from age, but from whatever he'd seen and done and survived. A scar ran from just below his left cheekbone down to the edge of his jaw. He wore it the way some men wore a brand, like something put on him against his will that he'd stopped trying to hide. 3 weeks ago, 2 cowboys from the Mercer spread had picked a fight with him outside the hardware store. One had pulled a knife. By the time it was over, both of them were on the ground, and Cole Ryder was walking away unhurried, like it hadn't been worth the effort to raise his heartbeat over. No one had pressed charges. No one had dared. And this was the man Harlan Pruitt was telling her to marry. "You cannot be serious," Clara said. "I assure you I am entirely serious, Mrs. Calloway. He's a gunfighter. He's killed men. He has never been convicted of any crime in this territory. He's physically capable, he's established a residence, and he's agreed to the arrangement." That stopped her. He agreed? He has. She turned that over in her mind and couldn't find a shape for it that made sense. "Why, that," Pruitt said, "is between Mr. Ryder and his conscience. Your concern is the ranch." He sat back in his chair. 7 days, Mrs. Calloway." She walked out of that courtroom, into the sharp Wyoming air, and stood on the wooden steps and breathed through her nose until the urge to scream passed. Pete Dawson was waiting with the wagon. He took one look at her face and said nothing. That was the thing about Pete. 63 years old, a face like crumpled paper, and the rare wisdom to understand that sometimes silence was the only mercy a person could offer. Clara climbed up onto the bench beside him. "Drive," she said. He drove. For a full mile she stared straight ahead at the road, and the brown winter grass bending in the wind, and the sky that was the kind of pale gray that promised nothing. Ethan had loved this road. He'd always said you could measure the health of the land by the color of the sky over it, and in winter, when the sky went that particular gray, you knew the cold was doing its job, and the water table was staying where it ought to be. He'd had thoughts like that. Small particular thoughts that she'd taken for granted so thoroughly she hadn't even realized she was storing them. She felt the grief try to surface, and she pressed it back down. Not now. She couldn't afford now. "Pete," she said. "Ma'am?" "Cole Ryder. What do you know about him that isn't rumor?" Pete was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was choosing words. "Hard to separate the one from the other where that man's concerned," he said finally. "Try." Another pause. "He showed up here in September. Rode in alone, 1 horse, 1 bedroll, maybe $40 in his pocket from the look of him. Took some fence work from the Hendersons, then from Dan Lowry over at the Creek property. Does what he's hired to do and doesn't overcharge." Pete turned the wagon around a rut in the road. "Never been drunk since he got here. Never started trouble. Never cheated nobody out of wages. When he beat those Mercer boys down, it was because they came at him, not the other way around. And before he came here." That's where it gets harder to say what's true. Pete's jaw worked for a moment. "War record's real, I think. Scouts under General Crook, if you believe what I've heard. After the war, there's stories. Gunfights, yeah. Men dead. But nobody that anybody can point to and say that man didn't deserve killing." Clara absorbed that. "He's agreed to marry me." Pete didn't react much, but his hands tightened on the reins just slightly. "I heard that was the direction things were heading." "You knew?" "I heard talk this morning. I wasn't sure it was truth." "Did you think to warn me?" Pete looked at her sideways, and his expression was carefully, achingly kind. "Mrs. Clara, would it have changed what happened in that room if I had—" She didn't answer. Because no. It wouldn't have changed a single thing. The trap had already been set. All she'd done by walking into that courtroom was spring it. "I'm not marrying him," she said. Pete said nothing. I'll find another way. I'll contact a lawyer in Cheyenne. I'll write to the territorial governor. There's no time for Cheyenne, Pete said quietly. And the governor doesn't move fast on things like this. You know that. Clara pressed her fingers together in her lap until her knuckles went white. Then I'll fight the ruling in court. On what grounds Pruitt's got the law written the way he wants it? He's been judge 11 years. He knows every lever in that machine. Then I will find who's pulling his levers, and I will cut their hands off, she said, and her voice came out so flat and precise that Pete glanced over at her again, with something that might have been under different circumstances, admiration. Yes, ma'am, he said carefully. I believe you might. But they both knew she had 7 days. Awusag. Cole Ryder came to her ranch the next morning. She was in the yard when she heard the horse, and she turned and watched him ride up the track toward the house, and felt a complicated tangle of emotions that she refused to call fear, because it wasn't fear. It was something colder and more deliberate than fear. It was the recognition that this man was a problem she was going to have to solve. He dismounted without being invited and led his horse to the water trough and let it drink. Only then did he look at her. He was taller than she'd realized from seeing him at a distance in town. Broad through the shoulders, lean everywhere else, with the kind of physical stillness that came from years of knowing that unnecessary movement drew unnecessary attention. The scar on his face caught the morning light. His eyes were a dark, unremarkable brown that would have been ordinary on any other face on his. They were the most unsettling thing about him, because they looked at her with an attention so complete and so quiet that it felt like being measured for something she hadn't agreed to be measured for. He wore a sidearm. He wore it the way men who'd grown up with guns wore them, not displayed, not hidden, simply present like a hand or a boot. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. His voice was low and slightly rougher than she'd expected, like gravel under a slow wheel. "Mr. Ryder." She crossed her arms and planted her feet. "I don't remember inviting you onto my property." "You didn't." He didn't apologize for it. He just stood there. "I figured we ought to talk before Friday." "I don't think there's anything to talk about. I haven't agreed to this arrangement, and I'm not going to." Something moved in his face, not quite an expression, more the shadow of one. "I understand that." "Then why are you here?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that complete unsettling attention. And then he said, "Because I wanted you to hear it from me directly, before you heard whatever version Pruitt and his men put out." That wasn't what she had expected him to say. She kept her arms crossed and kept her weight even on both feet and kept her face exactly where she wanted it. Why I agreed. I already asked the judge that question. He said it was between you and your conscience. Pruitt doesn't know my reasons." He reached up and touched the brim of his hat briefly, not quite tipping it, more of a habit without the full gesture. "I know what they're saying about me in this town. I know what you've heard. Most of it's probably at least half true." A pause. "But I've been watching this ranch since I got to Clearwater. I watched your husband run it. He was a good man and a fair sheriff." Another pause, shorter this time. "And I've been watching since he died 3 weeks ago. Watching the men who circle a property when the person standing on it suddenly looks like easier prey." Clara's jaw tightened. "I am not prey." "No," he said simply. "You're not, but Wade Mercer thinks you are. So do at least 2 other men I could name. And Pruitt's been in Mercer's pocket for the last 4 years if anybody cared to look carefully enough at the county land records." He let that land. Then, "I don't want your ranch, Mrs. Calloway. I don't want anything that's yours. But if you lose that property, you lose it to men who'll strip it down to the bones inside of a year. And I figured—" He stopped, looked away from her for the first time toward the distant line of fences and the grass beyond them. "I figured at least I could be the thing standing between you and that." Clara stared at him. She hated that it made sense. She hated it with a genuine bone-deep fury, because she wanted this to be simple, and it wasn't simple. She wanted him to be exactly what she'd assumed: a threat wearing boots and a gun, and he was standing in her yard making arguments she couldn't easily dismiss. "If I agree to this," she said carefully, And I'm not saying I am. What exactly are you expecting to get out of it? He looked back at her. Nothing. Men don't agree to arrangements for nothing. No, he said. They don't. Most men. His jaw shifted slightly. I've spent the last 10 years taking things and breaking things and leaving things worse than I found them. I'm not looking to do that here. He held her gaze. I'll never touch you unless you ask me to. That's a promise I'll keep if it kills me. You run the ranch the way you see fit. I'll follow your lead, do the work that needs doing, and stay out of your way otherwise. Silence stretched between them. A promise, she said. Yes, ma'am. And what does a man with your history know about keeping promises? It should have stung him. She'd meant it to. Instead, he absorbed it quietly the way a stone wall absorbs a thrown rock and said, Not enough. But I know this one I'll keep. Clara turned away from him and stared out at her land. The land Ethan had loved. The land she'd poured 6 years of her own life into the fences and the water rights and the grass that ran all the way to where the sky met the earth, and she felt the grief and the fury and the impossible mathematics of the situation pressing in on her from all sides. She had 7 days. She had no lawyer in time, no governor, no ally with enough standing to challenge Pruitt in his own courtroom. She had a silent, scarred gunfighter standing in her yard making promises with those quiet, unsettling eyes. You sleep in the bunkhouse, she said without turning around. You eat with the hands. You don't touch anything in the main house without my permission. You don't speak for me in town. You don't make decisions about this property without coming to me first. A long pause. Understood, Cole Ryder said. And if you break that promise, any part of it, I will find a way to make your life considerably more difficult than it already is. Are we clear? Yes, ma'am. She turned back around and looked at him directly. Then God help us both, Mr. Ryder. Go put your horse in the second stall. Pete will show you where things are. The wedding happened on Friday at 10 in the morning, in the same courtroom where the ultimatum had been delivered in front of Judge Pruitt, and 6 witnesses that Clara had not chosen and would not have chosen if given the option. She wore the gray dress she wore to town for business. Not the black one she refused to grieve this day, the same way she'd grieved Ethan's, and not the blue one because she wasn't in the business of prettifying a legal transaction. Gray. Practical. Clear-eyed. Cole wore a clean shirt and his one jacket and had shaved that morning, which she noticed only because she'd braced herself not to care about details, and then noticed the detail anyway and found it annoying. He stood beside her at the front of the courtroom with his hands at his sides and his eyes forward and said the required words in a voice so level and controlled it gave nothing away. When it was done and Pruitt said the words that made it legal, Cole turned to her, and for a moment something moved across his face that she still couldn't read. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not the barely concealed hunger of a man who thought he'd just won something. It was more like a man who'd agreed to carry a weight and was testing whether his legs would hold. He didn't try to kiss her. She hadn't expected him to based on what she knew of him by now, but she'd halfway braced for it anyway. That assumption of entitlement that she'd seen in men her entire adult life. The reach and the claim disguised as affection. It didn't come. Instead, he held out his hand formally, as though they'd just concluded a business negotiation. She shook it. His grip was exactly what she'd expected, firm, careful, brief. They walked out of the courthouse side by side, and Clara kept her chin level and her pace steady and looked at everyone who looked at her without blinking, and if any of them saw something complicated happening behind her eyes, none of them were brave enough to say so. Wade Mercer was waiting on the steps outside. He was 46, thick-necked, florid-faced, with the permanent expression of a man who'd been told he was important often enough that he'd started believing it without question. He ran the second-largest cattle operation in the county and had made no secret of his interest in the Callaway water rights since before Ethan's funeral was cold. Well? Mercer said, looking from Clara to Cole with a smile that had no warmth anywhere in it. I suppose congratulations are in order, though I imagine it's quite a step down, Clara. From a sheriff to a... He paused, letting the pause do the cruelty for him, drifter. Clara had lived 31 years, and in that time she had developed a fairly precise understanding of what kind of man she was dealing with. She knew men like Wade Mercer, the way you knew bad weather by the particular quality of pressure in the air before it arrived. She opened her mouth. Cole spoke first. It was the first time she'd seen him move faster than measured, and it was startling. Not violent, not aggressive, just sudden and absolute, like a door swinging shut. He stepped forward until he was close enough that Mercer would have had to tilt his chin slightly to maintain eye contact, and he said very quietly, "You're going to want to reconsider that sentence." Mercer's smile flickered. Just once. "Is that a threat, Ryder?" "It's an observation." Cole's voice didn't change volume or temperature. It had the quality of a calm river running over stone, steady, unhurried, and carrying considerably more force than it looked like on the surface. "You've got opinions about Mrs. Calloway's choices. You can keep those opinions wherever you keep the rest of your private thoughts, or you can say them out loud in front of this courthouse, and then you and I are going to have a different kind of conversation." A pause exactly as long as it needed to be. "Your call, Mercer." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Mercer looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him with a complete absence of expression that she'd learned from years of dealing with men who were searching her face for weakness. He found nothing useful there, and he looked back at Cole, and something shifted in his posture. Not defeat, exactly more, a strategic retreat dressed up as dignity. "Welcome to the county, Ryder," Mercer said, and it came out sounding like something else entirely. He walked away. Clara waited until he was out of earshot and then said without looking at Cole, "I told you not to speak for me in town." "I didn't speak for you," Cole said. "I spoke to him." "That's a distinction without a difference." "It's a difference that matters." He paused. "I wouldn't have done it if he'd spoken to you." "But he spoke about you. That's another thing." Clara turned and looked at him. He was watching Mercer's retreating back with an expression that was not quite satisfaction, and not quite warning, and not quite anything she had a clean word for. "It's going to cause problems," she said. "Men like Mercer don't back down. They just go sideways." "I know." He looked back at her. "I've met a lot of men like Mercer." "Then you know this made things harder." "Maybe." He held her gaze. "But I'll take harder over watching him speak your name that way, and doing nothing." Clara opened her mouth and then closed it again because the response she'd been assembling suddenly didn't fit quite the way she'd intended. She turned toward the wagon instead. "Come on," she said. "We have work to do." Tugged. The first week was like learning to walk in a room where someone had rearranged the furniture in the dark. Clara ran her morning differently than she ever had, not because Cole demanded anything different, but because his presence changed the weight of everything. When she came out to the yard to give the day's orders to her hands, he was already there, already working, having apparently risen before the sun, and spent the early hours reinforcing the north fence line that had been sagging since October, and that she'd been meaning to address for 3 weeks. Pete told her quietly over coffee that Cole had done it without being asked. "He noticed it needed doing," she said. "Seems like he notices a lot of things," Pete said carefully in a tone that wasn't quite approval, but was moving in that general direction. When 2 ranch hands from the neighboring Morrison property came by to discuss a cattle dispute at the east boundary, Clara handled the conversation herself coolly, directly knowing the details of her land the way she knew her own hands. Cole stayed at the far end of the yard and worked on the broken hinge of the barn door, and did not insert himself, did not interrupt, did not look over to check whether she was managing. After Morrison's men rode out, apparently satisfied, she walked past Cole on her way back to the house and said without stopping, "Thank you for not interfering." "You didn't need interference," he said. She didn't respond. But that night at dinner, which they ate at opposite ends of the same table, because the house had only one table, and there was no reasonable way around that, she noticed that he ate quietly, and without complaint, and asked for nothing. And when she pushed the bread toward his side of the table without comment, he took a piece with a nod that acknowledged the gesture without making it into anything more than it was. She told herself she didn't notice things like that. She told herself very firmly twice on her way to her room that night. She noticed anyway. It was on the 5th night that the first real trouble arrived. She heard the horses around midnight, not one or two. The sound of a group moving along the south pasture fence line, deliberate and slow. The way men moved when they were making a point of being heard. She was out of bed and pulling on her boots before she'd consciously decided to, and she came out the back door of the house and stopped. Cole was already in the yard. He was standing at this corner of the house with his arms at his sides and his eyes on the dark beyond the fence, perfectly still, and she could tell from the set of his shoulders that he'd been there for a while. He'd heard them before she had. Of course he had. "How many?" she said, her voice low. "4 horses. They're not coming in." He didn't look at her. "They're just riding the line." "Mercer's men." "Most likely." "They do this again, I'm going out there." "If you go out there tonight," he said, still in that quiet, level voice, "you give them exactly what they want. A confrontation they can shape into whatever story suits them. And if I do nothing, they ride my fence line every night until they find something to use against me. They won't find anything." He finally looked at her briefly. "Not tonight. Tonight they're just telling you they're watching." "And what are you telling me, to tolerate it, eh? No?" His voice was flat and final. "I'm telling you to be patient for one night. There's a difference." A pause. "I'll be here." She stared at him in the dark for a moment. This man she had known for less than a week. This scarred, quiet, unlikely thing the court had dropped into the middle of her life. And she found to her considerable annoyance that she believed him. "If they come over that fence," she said, "you wake me." "Yes, ma'am." She went back inside. She didn't sleep, but neither did he. In the morning, when she came out at first light, he was sitting on the top rail of the yard fence with a cup of coffee watching the sunrise, and the south pasture line was undisturbed, and whatever Mercer's men had hoped to accomplish by their midnight ride, it hadn't worked. Pete brought her coffee without being asked, and she stood beside Cole's fence rail and drank it, and neither of them said anything, and the silence between them was not comfortable exactly. Not yet. But no longer hostile. It was the first thing they'd built together without discussing it, without agreeing to it. Just silence and coffee and a fence line that held. That morning set the tone for everything that followed. 2 people side by side, not quite together, not quite separate, occupying the uneasy middle ground between strangers and something neither of them had a clean name for yet. The second week was harder than the first, not because of what happened between them, but because of what started happening around them. Clearwater was a small town. Small towns ran on story the way engines ran on fuel, and the story of Clara Calloway marrying Cole Ryder 3 days after her husband's funeral was exactly the kind of story a small town could not leave alone. It got handled and turned over and passed from mouth to mouth until the edges softened and the facts blurred, and what was left bore only a passing resemblance to what had actually occurred in that courtroom. Clara heard the first version from Margaret Howell, the draper's wife, who stopped her wagon outside the dry goods store with the particular energy of a woman delivering news she found both scandalous and delicious. "People are saying you arranged it yourself," Margaret said, leaning over from her wagon seat with her voice dropped to a stage whisper that carried 20 feet in every direction. "That you had your eye on that Ryder man before Ethan was even cold." Clara looked at her for a long, steady moment. "People say a lot of things, Margaret." "Well, I'm just telling you what's being said." "I know what you're doing." Clara gathered her packages from the store step. "And I know what you're not doing, which is asking me what actually happened. So let me save you the trouble. The judge ordered it. I had no choice, and the ranch is still standing. That's the whole story." She climbed up onto her wagon seat. "You have a good afternoon." She drove away before Margaret could construct a response. But she felt the woman's eyes on her back the entire length of the street, and she knew that conversation would be in 4 more mouths before sundown. What she didn't know yet, what she would find out 3 days later from Pete, who had it from the blacksmith, who had it from someone at the church board, was that Wade Mercer had already been working the rumor mill for a week. He hadn't been idle after that courthouse steps encounter. He'd gone sideways just as Clara had predicted, and the direction he'd chosen was character assassination. The version Mercer was spreading was elegant in its ugliness. Clara had grown tired of her aging sheriff husband. Clara had developed an attachment to the dangerous drifter who'd been doing occasional work near the county. Ethan Calloway's death, and Mercer was careful to say only, "Some people wonder," and never anything direct, might not have been as straightforward as everyone assumed. And now here was the widow, married to her gunfighter within a week, with the ranch conveniently secured and the old husband conveniently in the ground. Clara heard this and sat completely still at her kitchen table for almost a full minute. Then she said very quietly, "He's accusing me of killing Ethan." Pete sat across from her with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup and his face carefully arranged into something that was not confirmation but wasn't denial either. "He's not saying it plain," Pete said. "He's just asking questions in the right places." "Questions," she repeated. "The kind that don't need answers to do their damage." She stood up from the table. Her chair scraped back hard against the floor. "Where is Cole?" "North pasture. Why?" "Because I need to think, and I need him not to do something that makes this worse." She was already moving toward the door. "If he hears this before I talk to him—" "He already heard it," Pete said. "Tom Walsh told him this morning." Clara stopped. She turned around slowly. And Pete's expression was careful, the way a man looks when he's about to say something he knows will land hard. "He's still out there fixing fence. Hasn't come back. Been out there about 4 hours." She understood what that meant. A man who hadn't ridden into town and done something violent about it. A man who'd taken the kind of news that would have sent most men straight to the source with blood in his eyes, and instead had put his hands to work and kept them there for 4 hours. She grabbed her coat and went out to the north pasture. She found him exactly where Pete said he'd be working the line methodical driving posts with a precision that had more force behind it than strictly necessary. She watched him for a moment before he heard her coming. His back was to her, his shoulders moving with each swing, and she could read the tension in him from 30 feet away. The extra drive in each blow, the set of his jaw that she'd learned in 2 weeks, meant he was containing something. "I know," she said when she got close enough. He stopped, turned, looked at her with those dark, direct eyes, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "What do you want to do about it?" he said finally. She'd expected anger. She'd expected the tight-leashed fury she'd seen flash across his face on the courthouse steps, or the cold efficiency she'd seen the night of Mercer's riders on the fence line. She hadn't expected the question. Clean and direct and aimed straight at her, not what he wanted to do, not what he thought should be done. What she wanted. "I want to go into town tomorrow," she said. "I want to handle my business at the feed store and the bank and the post office, and I want to do it exactly the way I would have done it last month before any of this. I want to walk through that town like I have nothing to be ashamed of, because I don't." He nodded once. "All right. And I want you to come with me, not to protect me, not to intimidate anyone. Just present." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, but close to it, like a door opening slightly in a wall he'd assumed was solid. "All right," he said again. "And if we run into Mercer—" "I'll follow your lead," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer, making sure she was reading what she thought she was reading. And then she turned and walked back toward the house, and she told herself very firmly that the feeling settling in her chest was not relief. It was simply the recognition that a useful arrangement was functioning as intended. She was about 40% convinced of this by the time she reached the house. The next morning, they rode into Clearwater together. The town noticed. Of course it noticed. She felt it the moment they turned onto Main Street, the slight pause in activity, the way conversations dropped a register, the way eyes found them, and then found somewhere else to be, with the guilty speed of people who'd been discussing the very subject that just walked through the door. Clara kept her chin level and her pace even, and went directly to the feed store where she had business that needed doing, regardless of what any of them thought. She ordered what she needed, discussed pricing with old Herbert Crane, paid what she owed, and conducted the entire transaction with the calm efficiency of a woman whose primary concern was the running of a ranch, which it was. Cole stood near the door of the feed store and said nothing, and moved nothing except his eyes, which tracked the room the way a man's eyes do when he's spent years in situations where not tracking a room could get you killed. Herbert Crane kept his conversation with Clara professionally focused and did not look at Cole more than twice, which Clara filed away as one point in Herbert's favor. The bank was where it went wrong. Samuel Briggs was the bank manager and had been for 8 years, and prided himself apparently on the kind of blunt moral authority that substitutes for genuine courage in men who have neither the integrity to stay quiet nor the backbone to be directly unkind. He processed her account transfer with his eyes on his desk and his jaw tight, and when she pushed the completed paperwork back across to him and said, "Thank you, Mr. Briggs," he looked up and said with the careful precision of a man who'd rehearsed it, "I hope you understand, Mrs. Calloway, that certain members of this community have concerns about the current arrangements at the Calloway property." Clara put both hands flat on his desk, slowly, deliberately. "Certain members," she said. "Would you like to name those members, Mr. Briggs? Or would you prefer to say what you actually mean?" Briggs's neck reddened. "I only mean that the town has questions about. The town can ask me its questions directly." She kept her voice absolutely level. "If anyone in Clearwater County has something they'd like to say to my face, I'm available. What I am not available for is implication delivered by proxy over a bank desk." She picked up her paperwork. "My accounts are in order. My land is in order. My conscience is clear. Good day, Mr. Briggs." She turned and walked out, and Cole fell into step beside her without a word, and she got halfway down the block before she let out the breath she'd been holding. "That was well done," he said quietly. "Don't compliment me on controlling my own temper," she said. "It's not a skill that should need complimenting." She felt him almost smile, just the shift in the air beside her, not quite a sound. "Fair enough," he said. They were at the wagon when Mercer found them. He came out of the saloon across the street with 2 of his ranch hands flanking him like a performance of confidence, and he crossed the road with the deliberate swagger of a man who'd decided to play the scene he'd been building toward all week. There were people on the street. He'd picked the moment. That told Clara everything she needed to know about what kind of confrontation this was going to be. "Clara," Mercer said in a tone of voice designed to sound concerned while delivering something else entirely. "I've been meaning to have a word." "I have nothing to say to you, Wade." "Well, I have something to say to you." He stopped a few feet away, thumbs in his belt, looking at her with that particular expression of righteous certainty that men wear when they've decided that cruelty is actually concern. "People in this town care about you. People who knew Ethan. And there is genuine worry about your situation. A woman living on an isolated property with a man of Ryder's reputation. My situation," Clara said, "is my business. It becomes this town's business when it reflects on Ethan's memory." He let that sit for exactly 1 beat, long enough to be cruel, but brief enough to have deniability. "And when questions start circulating about how exactly a man in Ethan's health came to die so sudden," Cole moved. It wasn't slow, and it wasn't gradual, and it wasn't preceded by any of the measured stillness she'd come to associate with him. It was immediate and absolute. One moment he was beside her, and the next he had Mercer's collar in his fist, and Mercer's back against the side of the feed store wall, and the 2 ranch hands went for their guns and stopped when they registered what was in Cole's eyes, because whatever was in his eyes in that moment was the kind of thing that made men decide very quickly that they'd rather not. The street went completely silent. Cole's voice came out quiet. Not loud, not shouted. Quieter than his normal speaking voice, and somehow that was worse. "Say her husband's name again," he said. "Say it one more time the way you just said it, and I want you to think very carefully about whether whatever point you're trying to make is worth what comes next." Mercer's face had gone from florid to white with the speed of a man who'd miscalculated significantly. "You're making a mistake, Ryder." "No." Cole's grip didn't loosen. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. Letting this go any further isn't going to be one of them." He leaned in, and his voice dropped even lower, low enough that the gathered crowd on the street could see but not quite hear. "Ethan Calloway was a better man than you or I will ever be. His wife has done nothing to deserve what you've been putting out in this town, and if I hear his name or her name come out of your mouth the wrong way one more time—" He paused. "They'll bury what's left." The silence stretched. Then Cole released him, stepped back, smoothed the front of his own jacket with a deliberateness that was somehow more threatening than the grab had been, because it communicated that the whole thing had cost him nothing. No elevated heart rate, no trembling hands, just a task that had needed doing and had been done. He looked at the two ranch hands. They found reasons to look elsewhere. He turned back to Clara, and what she saw in his face then was not triumph. It was something closer to apology, a man who had told himself he would follow her lead and had not followed her lead and knew it. "I know," she said before he could speak. "I told you not to speak for me." "Yes, ma'am. That was—" She stopped, chose words. "That was different from speaking for me." He looked at her steadily. "Let's go home," she said. They drove back to the ranch in silence, and the silence was different from the silences that had come before it. Those had been the silence of strangers carefully maintaining distance. This one had a different texture. Charged the way the air gets charged before weather, not yet what it would become, but no longer what it had been. That night, the storm that had been threatening all week finally broke. The thunder rolled in from the northwest just after 9, and the rain hit the roof hard, and the wind moved through the yard in gusts that set the horses shifting in their stalls. Clara sat at the kitchen table, going over account ledgers by lamplight, because the ledgers needed doing, and the storm gave her something to listen to other than her own thoughts. She heard the door before she heard him, just the specific creak of the threshold that she'd learned by now to distinguish from the sound the wind made on the frame. She looked up. Cole was standing in the kitchen doorway, with his hat in his hand and water on his shoulders from crossing the yard, and there was something about his face that she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled stillness, not the contained fury, not the professional assessment of men and situations. Something quieter and less defended than any of that. "I needed to apologize," he said, "for today, in town. I told you it was different. It was still not what I said I'd do." His voice was even, but there was an effort in the evenness that she could hear now. "I said I'd follow your lead. I didn't." He turned his hat in his hands once the way a man does when his hands need somewhere to be. "I'd do it again," he added. "I want you to know that. I'd do exactly the same thing, but I'd do it having told you I was going to not just—" He stopped. "Not just reacting." She set down her pen. She looked at him across the kitchen in the lamplight with the storm loud against the windows, and she thought about a man who'd spent the better part of 2 weeks being careful and measured, and deliberately restrained, and who had broken that restraint in a single unplanned moment because someone had spoken about a dead sheriff's honor in a degrading way. Not because of the ranch, not because of the arrangement, because of Ethan's name. "Why did it matter to you?" she asked. "Ethan's reputation. He's gone. What Mercer says about him can't hurt him." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, "It hurts you." She didn't have anything to say to that. "And he was a good man," Cole continued. "I didn't know him well, but I watched him for 3 months from a distance, the way I watch most things, and he was fair, and he was honest, and he wore that badge like it meant something. Men like that—" He stopped again. Jaw shifted. "Men like that deserve better than what Mercer was doing to his name." Clara realized she had stood up from the table at some point without meaning to. She was standing now, and the distance between her and the doorway was smaller than it had been, though she wasn't sure when that had changed. She crossed the last of it. She raised her hand and touched the scar on his face, not a timid touch, not a questioning one, but direct the way she did. Most things, her fingertips tracing the length of it from just below his cheekbone to the line of his jaw, and she felt him go very still under her hand, not away, still, but present, still, the way a thing holds itself when it doesn't want to startle something into flight. "How did you get it?" she asked. It took him a moment to answer. "Battle of the Wilderness, 64. A pause. "Blade, not bullet. I was lucky. Were you?" "Not everyone who came out of that woods came out standing," he said. "So yes." She looked at him. The lamplight moved with the draft from the window. Outside, the thunder rolled again closer now, and the rain intensified against the glass, and she was aware of all of it simultaneously. The storm, the light, the specific quality of his stillness, the fact that her hand was still against the line of his jaw. She kissed him. It was not planned. It was not preceded by thought. It came from the same place that the grief came from, and the fury, and the stubbornness that had kept her standing in that courtroom, when what she'd wanted to do was fall to her knees. Some deep place that did not consult her before it acted. He didn't pull away. He didn't press forward either. He kissed her back with a care so deliberate, it was almost unbearable, like a man handling something he was terrified of breaking. And when she finally stepped back, his hands had never moved from his sides. The storm knocked hard against the house. Clara looked at him, and he looked back at her. And both of them were breathing slightly differently than they had been 30 seconds ago, and neither of them said a single word about what had just happened, because there were no words yet built for what had just happened between them. "Good night, Mr. Ryder," she said finally. His voice was not entirely steady. "Good night, Mrs. Calloway." He turned and walked back out into the rain. She stood in the kitchen and listened to his footsteps cross the yard, and she pressed her hand flat against the table and breathed through her nose until the feeling in her chest settled into something she could manage, and she thought, this is a problem. She thought this is the worst possible complication. She thought his hands never moved from his sides. She had reached for him first, and he had not assumed a single thing past what she offered, and he had walked back out into a Wyoming storm, rather than stay one moment longer than invited. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a very long time, and outside in the bunkhouse in the dark and the rain, the man who had promised never to touch her unless she asked, lay awake with the memory of her hand against his face, and understood for the first time in years that he was in something he did not know how to survive losing. Neither of them spoke about the kiss the next morning. Clara came out at first light the way she always did, and Cole was already in the yard the way he always was, and they went about the work of the ranch with the particular care of two people who have agreed without words not to look directly at the thing that had changed between them. It was like walking around a fire. You knew it was there. You felt the heat. You just kept your eyes somewhere else and told yourself you were fine. It lasted 4 days more or less, not because either of them was dishonest by nature, but because the ranch didn't stop needing work just because two people on it were conducting an elaborate pretense of normalcy, and work was the one language they'd been fluent in together from the start. Fence lines and cattle counts and water levels and the slow arithmetic of a working operation, all of it kept moving, and they moved with it side by side, and somewhere inside that motion, the distance between them shortened, without either of them quite authorizing it. It was Pete who finally broke the surface tension in the way that Pete periodically did things without warning and without particular apology for the disruption. He caught Clara alone in the barn on the 5th morning and said without preamble, "That man is in love with you." Clara kept her hands on the task in front of her. "Pete, I'm not asking. I'm telling you what I see. What you see and what's actually true are two different things. Not in this case." Pete's voice was dry and patient the way it got when he'd already decided he was right and was merely waiting for the evidence to accumulate. "I've worked horses and cattle and stubborn women for 40 years. Mrs. Clara and I know the look of a creature trying not to want something it already wants. That man looks at you when you're not watching, and it costs him something every single time." Clara set down what she was holding, turned around. "That is not a conversation I'm having right now." "No, ma'am, I expect not." Pete picked up his work and made for the barn door. "Just thought you ought to know what you're not paying attention to." She stood in the barn after he left and breathed through her nose and told herself she was annoyed. She was. But the annoyance sat on top of something else that she'd been deliberately not examining, and Pete's words had disturbed the surface of it, and now it was harder to pretend it wasn't there. That evening she went looking for Cole. She found him at the water trough, washing up after the day's work, and she walked out to him with her hands in her jacket pockets and said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it plainly." He straightened, dried his hands on his pants, looked at her. "All right." "That night in the kitchen. You don't have to." "I'm not apologizing for it," she said sharply, and he stopped. "I'm not asking you to either. I'm asking you—" She stopped herself, started over. "Are you all right with what happened?" He looked at her for a long moment. The question had plainly not been what he'd braced for, because something shifted in his face that she recognized now as the expression he wore when he was recalculating. "Yes," he said finally. "That's not an answer. That's a syllable." His jaw moved. "What do you want me to say, Clara?" It was the first time he'd used only her first name. No Mrs. Calloway, no formal distance, just her name in that low, careful voice, and it landed differently than she'd expected, and she had to make a deliberate decision not to let that show. "I want you to say what's true," she said. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I've spent 10 years making sure I didn't have anything to lose. It was the only way I could function. If nothing matters, nothing can be taken." He looked somewhere past her shoulder, then back. "And then I walked into your kitchen in a rainstorm, and you put your hand on my face and I—" He stopped, jaw tight. "I realized I'd made a significant miscalculation." Clara's heart did something inconvenient that she filed away to examine at a time when she could afford to. Meaning something matters now. His eyes were very direct. "That's what's true." She held his gaze for a count of 3. Then she said, "I'm going to need some time to figure out what that means for me." "Take whatever time you need." "And in the meantime—" "Nothing changes," he said. "I meant what I said, on the first day. Nothing changes unless you say so." She nodded once, turned to go back to the house, got 3 steps and stopped without entirely knowing why, and said over her shoulder, "For what it's worth, I'm not sorry either." She didn't wait to see what his face did with that, but she heard very faintly, just at the edge of hearing the slow exhale of a man releasing something he'd been holding for a long time. The days that followed had a different quality than the days that came before. Something had been named between them, not fully, not completely, but enough to change the air. Cole was still careful, still deliberate, still scrupulously respectful of every line she'd drawn. But the careful now felt like choice rather than distance, and that distinction was everything. He started talking more. Not much, he wasn't built for much, but enough. Over dinner, which they'd gradually moved from opposite ends of the table to a more reasonable proximity, he'd offer things. Not stories exactly, more like pieces. A comment about the North Water table. An observation about the weather pattern building over the mountains. Once, unexpectedly, a dry remark about one of the younger ranch hands that was so precisely and quietly funny that Clara laughed before she could decide whether she wanted to, and the sound surprised both of them, and Cole looked at her with something open and unguarded in his face that she was not prepared for, and that took her breath in a way she didn't examine too closely. She found herself doing the same thing, offering pieces. A memory of the first winter on the ranch when the well froze, and she and Ethan had hauled water by hand for 3 weeks and laughed about it, because what else could you do? A thought about the cattle breeding program she'd been planning since spring. The particular satisfaction of watching the east fence line finally sitting level and true after years of it listing to the left. Pete watched all of this and said nothing and looked satisfied in the way that extremely annoying people look when events are proceeding exactly as predicted. It was on a Wednesday, 11 days after the kiss, that Harold Grayson rode into Clearwater. Clara didn't know his name yet when Pete brought her the news. She was in the yard working through the morning accounting when Pete came from town with a face that told her before he opened his mouth that the news was not small. "There's a man," Pete said. "Arrived on the morning train from Cheyenne. Brought 6 men with him, armed all of them, wearing the same kind of expensive coat that doesn't come from anywhere west of St. Louis. He's taken the 2 best rooms at the Grand Hotel, and he's been asking questions. What kind of questions? Pete's voice was careful. About Cole. The arithmetic in Clara's chest shifted. What kind of questions about Cole? Where he goes, what his routine is, how many men are on your property, whether the property has a second entrance from the southern road. Pete met her eyes. The kind of questions a man asks when he's planning something. Clara set down her pen. Does Cole know? Not yet. I came to you first. She thought for exactly 3 seconds. Go find him. Bring him here. When Cole came in from the pasture and heard what Pete had to say, his face did something she'd never seen it do. It went not blank, but very still, in a way that was different from his ordinary stillness. This was the stillness of recognition, of a man who'd been waiting for a particular sound and had just heard it. Grayson, he said. One word and the weight behind it told her everything before he said another. You know him, she said. Cole sat down at the kitchen table the first time she'd seen him sit without being invited, and put both hands flat on the surface, and looked at them for a moment like he was looking at something that had nothing to do with his hands. Harold Grayson, he said. Railroad money out of Cheyenne. He has interests in about 12 counties across the territory, and he owns enough judges and sheriffs to fill a courtroom twice over. The cold that moved through Clara then started in her stomach and spread outward. Judges, she said. Yes. Cole, she kept her voice very steady. Tell me about his son. He looked up at her. In his eyes was the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a thing for a long time and has just been asked to set it down in front of someone. James Grayson, he said. 3 years ago in a town called Red Rock. James Grayson was drunk and he was mean, and he put a gun to a woman's head in the middle of a saloon because she'd refused him. I was there. He stopped. I stopped it. You killed him. He pulled first. No defensiveness in it, just fact. 3 witnesses said so. No charges were ever filed. But his father spent the next 3 years and a considerable amount of money finding out where I was. Cole's jaw set. I moved every few months, kept ahead of it. I thought when I got to Clearwater. He stopped. Something crossed his face. I thought it was small enough, far enough off the main roads. Clara stood very still. Cole? Her voice was careful now, each word placed deliberately the way you place your feet on ice you're not sure will hold. Why did Judge Pruitt order our marriage? The silence that followed lasted only 4 seconds. But those 4 seconds had a quality to them that she would remember for a very long time, the quality of ground shifting. He needed a reason to keep me in one place, Cole said. His voice was very quiet. A drifter moves. He stays ahead of things. But a man with a wife and a property. He stopped. A man with something to lose stays put. The cold spread all the way to Clara's hands. Pruitt, she said. Pruitt is Grayson's man. Cole looked at her and said nothing because there was nothing to say. The answer was in his face, and it had been there, she realized from the beginning. She just hadn't had the key to read it. She crossed the kitchen and braced both hands on the table across from him and looked at him directly. You knew, she said, when you agreed to the arrangement. Did you know? I suspected. His voice didn't waver. Not Grayson specifically, but I knew Pruitt was in somebody's pocket, and I knew somebody wanted me in a fixed location. The pause was short, but she heard everything in it. I didn't know it was this specific, and I didn't have a better option for protecting the ranch. The ranch, she said. You thought you could protect the ranch while also drawing whatever was coming away from you. He met her eyes. Yes, you used my property as a base. I tried to be useful while I was here. Cole. She heard the edge in her own voice and didn't try to remove it. Did it occur to you to let me make an informed decision about what I was agreeing to? His jaw tightened. If I told you, you would have refused the arrangement." "That was my right." "Yes," he said. It was. And the directness of the admission, the absence of excuse or deflection, took the sharpest edge off her anger, because she couldn't argue with it. He was right. She would have refused. She would have walked away from the one protection she had out of pure principle, and Mercer would have had the ranch inside a month, and she would have had nothing. "That doesn't make it all right," she said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She stood up straight, turned away from him. The fury was real, and it was valid, and she let it move through her without trying to manage it, because managing it right now would just mean it came back worse later. She walked to the window and looked out at the yard and the fence line, and the grass beyond, and thought about everything she'd built, and everything Ethan had built, and the 6 years of their lives embedded in this land. "How long do we have?" she said. "Before he moves." A pause as Cole calculated. "A day, maybe 2. He didn't come all this way to talk." She turned back around. "Then we need to get ahead of it." "Clara, don't." Her voice was firm. "Don't tell me to leave. Don't tell me to go somewhere safe. This is my land, and these are my hands, and if someone's coming for what's mine, I intend to be standing on it when they arrive." Cole looked at her for a long moment. Whatever argument he'd been building, he let it go. "All right," he said. "Get Pete. Tell him what we're dealing with. I want every ranch hand who's willing on alert tonight, and I want the rifles cleaned and loaded." He stood, moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, turned back. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I kept from you. I'd change it if I could." She looked at him across the kitchen. "I know you would," she said. "Now go." The attack came at 2 in the morning. She heard the horses first, too many of them too fast, coming from the south road exactly the way Pete's source in town had warned might happen. Then she heard the first shot, high and sharp in the cold air, and then the sound she'd been dreading: fire. They'd hit the east barn. She had the rifle in her hands before she was fully out the door, moving through the yard in the dark, and she could hear Cole somewhere ahead of her running, not shouting, because Cole didn't shout when he moved. He just moved with a speed and directness that she'd never quite gotten used to, even after weeks of watching him work. The next minutes were chaos, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, not even to herself. Grayson's men had numbers and surprise on their side. Her hands had the advantage of knowing the property, every fence line, every blind corner, every place you could put your back, and not worry about what was behind you. Pete organized the defense with a competence that she hadn't known to expect from him, and was fiercely grateful for, and Cole moved through the firefight like a man who'd done this before, and not just once. She shot twice. Both times at men she could clearly see in the firelight from the burning barn, both times at their horses' legs, rather than at the men themselves, because she wanted them off their horses and on the ground and out of the fight. And both times she hit what she was aiming at, and both times a man hit the ground cursing, and that was enough. It was over in 20 minutes. Not because Grayson's men ran out of bullets, but because 3 of them were down. None dead, but none getting up quickly, and the others had not bargained on this much resistance from a widowed rancher and a single gunfighter. They pulled back. Into the dark. Retreating up the south road the way they'd come, Clara stood in the yard and listened to the sound of them going, and breathed through her nose, and kept the rifle up until she was certain they were far enough out that it was safe to lower it. Her east barn was still burning. Her hands were working the water line. 2 of her men had injuries. Tom Brierly had a gash along his forearm from a fence post he'd fallen against in the dark, and young Davis had a graze along his shoulder that was bleeding steadily but was not serious. No one was dead. Cole came out of the dark from the direction of the south fence line, and she turned when she heard him and looked him over fast and completely in the firelight, the way she'd have looked over one of her own ranch hands, checking for damage with the same urgency, and found nothing. No blood, no obvious injury, and felt a relief so sudden and physical that it almost knocked the breath out of her. "They're gone," he said. "For tonight. Yes, for tonight." His voice was steady, but his breathing was slightly elevated, and she watched him scan the yard, assessing damage, counting people the same way she'd just done. "Tom's hurt. Gash on his arm. He'll be fine." She lowered the rifle. "The east barn is gone." "Most of it," he said. "The hands are doing what they can." She looked at him. He was standing 6 feet away in the firelight with his hat pushed back on his head, and what had probably been a clean shirt this morning, significantly less so now. And she thought about the moment 2 hours ago when she'd stood across the kitchen from him and been furious, genuinely, legitimately furious, and the moment 5 minutes ago when he'd come out of the dark and she'd checked him for bullet holes with her heart in her throat. She thought the ranch is still standing. She thought he's still standing. And she understood with a clarity that frightened her considerably, because clarity at 2 a.m. with a burning barn and armed men on her property was not a thing she'd been prepared for. That the order of those two thoughts was not accidental. She'd checked him first. Before the barn, before the fence line, before the count of her ranch hands. She had turned, and her eyes had gone to Cole, and only after she'd confirmed he was whole had her attention moved to anything else. She stood in her yard with that knowledge settling into her bones and the fire reflected in her eyes, and said nothing about it, because now was not the time, and she was not yet sure what to do with it. But she knew. And somewhere across the 6 feet between them, from the way Cole looked at her just then, direct and careful and carrying something he wasn't saying, she understood that he knew too. "Tomorrow," she said, "we end this." "Yes," he said quietly. "All of it. Grayson, Pruitt, the whole arrangement." She held his gaze. "Together," he nodded once, and in the firelight and the smoke, and the long, hard aftermath of something they'd both just survived, that single nod between them carried more weight than most conversations she'd had in her life. They didn't sleep the rest of that night. Clara sent the injured men inside and kept the others on rotation, watching the perimeter, and she and Cole sat at the kitchen table with the account ledgers pushed aside and a map of the county spread between them, and worked through the problem. The way you work through any serious problem piece by piece, without sentiment, with the particular clarity that comes when you've already survived the thing you were afraid of, and haven't yet had time to be afraid of the next thing. "Grayson can buy gunfighters faster than we can replace what we lost tonight," Cole said. He wasn't catastrophizing. He was doing arithmetic. Clara had learned to tell the difference. "He'll hit again, and next time he'll bring more men, and he'll have learned the layout of this property." "Then we don't wait for him to hit again," she said. "What's the alternative? He's got money, and he's got connections, and he's been doing this for 3 years. You can't outshoot Harold Grayson." "No," she said, "but I can outmaneuver him." She put her finger on the map. "Grayson's railroad investments are public record. His financial partners are public record. The land grants he's been accumulating across 4 territories, public record if you know where to look and who to ask." She looked up. "He spent 30 years building himself into an untouchable man. That kind of building leaves a paper trail a mile wide, and paper burns." Cole looked at her steadily. "You're going to go after his money. I'm going to go after his reputation, which is what his money is built on." She sat back. "The Cheyenne papers have been looking for something to run against the railroad expansion for 2 years. The railroad investors in Chicago and New York are nervous about anything that suggests instability in their Western holdings. And the Federal Marshal's office in Denver has an open file on Grayson's land acquisitions that they haven't been able to push forward because every witness who comes forward ends up," she paused, "unavailable. You'd be a target." "I'm already a target. The difference is right now he's choosing the ground." She folded the map with neat, decisive movements. "I want to choose it." Cole watched her hands. Then he looked at her face. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to stay here, visible. Keep the ranch running. Keep the hands calm. Make Grayson think we're in a defensive posture." She met his eyes. "And I need you to trust me to do the part I'm built for." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through the objections, the risk, the exposure, the dozen ways it could go wrong, and then making the decision she'd come to understand was characteristic of him, not the safe decision, but the right one. "All right," he said, just like that. "You know this territory better than I do. You know these people and their money and their politics." His voice was even. "I know how to handle a gun. We each do the part we're built for. That was always going to be how this worked." Clara looked at him for a long moment and felt something settle in her chest that wasn't quite peace, but was the closest thing to it she'd felt since Ethan died. "Get some sleep," she said. 2 hours. Then I need you to ride into town and pick up everything that came in on yesterday's train." He got up, stopped at the door. "Clara." "Yes." "Be careful what you start," he said quietly. "Men like Grayson don't go quiet." "Good," she said. "I want him loud. Loud men make mistakes." He almost smiled. She was learning to catch those, the almost smiles, the slight shift around his eyes, the half-second where the controlled face allowed something through before it closed again. This one was there and gone. He went. She stayed at the table and started writing letters. Over the next 4 days, Clara Calloway waged a campaign that would have impressed a military strategist and surprised everyone in Clearwater County who'd ever made the mistake of thinking she was only a rancher's wife. She wrote to the Cheyenne Daily Leader and the Wyoming Tribune with documented evidence of Grayson's coercion of Judge Pruitt, including the land transfer records she'd pulled from county files 3 weeks ago on an instinct she hadn't fully understood at the time. She wrote to 3 railroad investment firms in Chicago, outlining the legal and reputational exposure of continuing to partner with a man whose operations were under federal scrutiny. She wrote to Marshal David Reeves in Denver, whom Ethan had corresponded with regularly, and she enclosed with her letter a set of affidavits from 2 Clearwater County residents who had witnessed Pruitt taking payment from Grayson's intermediaries on separate occasions. She did not do any of this quietly. That was the point. A quiet campaign could be suppressed. A quiet campaign could be bought or threatened into silence, or simply ignored by men who controlled enough of the mechanisms that silence could be enforced. Clara wasn't interested in quiet. She wanted the noise so widespread and so public that buying all of it would cost more than even Grayson could afford, and suppressing it would only amplify it. She sent Pete to deliver some of the letters personally. She had 2 of her ranch hands ride to adjacent counties with sealed documents for specific addressees. She published a letter under her own name in the Clearwater Gazette, a small paper, but one that fed content to 3 larger papers in the territory outlining in plain and measured language exactly what had happened to her since her husband's death. The courtroom ultimatum, the arranged marriage, the attack on her property, and the name of the man she held responsible. She signed it Clara Calloway, and she didn't soften a single word. The response was faster than she'd anticipated. On the second day, 2 of Grayson's financial partners in Chicago sent representatives to Cheyenne with instructions to meet with him and assess the situation. This Pete's contact in Cheyenne told them had made Grayson furious in the particular way of a man who is used to problems being managed before they reach him and has just discovered this one has gotten considerably ahead of the management. On the 3rd day, the Cheyenne Daily Leader ran her story on the front page. On the 4th day, Marshal David Reeves sent a telegraph to Clearwater stating that federal marshals were being dispatched and would arrive within 48 hours. And on the 4th day in the late afternoon, Harold Grayson himself rode to the edge of the Calloway property and stopped his horse at the boundary fence and waited. Cole saw him first. He came to find Clara in the house with a specific quality of stillness in his walk that she'd learned meant something significant had shifted in the immediate situation. "He's here," Cole said. "At the south fence, alone." "Alone," she repeated. "Or appearing to be." His eyes were careful. "His men are somewhere." She took her coat from the hook. "Come with me." "Clara." "I'm not going alone. Come with me." They walked out together to the south fence line, and Harold Grayson sat his horse on the other side of it and waited for them with the patience of a very old predator that has learned that patience is its most effective weapon. He was 60, perhaps 62, with a face that had once been handsome and was now something harder, all the softness burned away by decades of acquisition and ruthlessness. He wore an excellent coat and carried himself like a man who had not been told no in a very long time. He looked at Clara first, then at Cole, then back at Clara, and there was a calculation in his eyes that she recognized because she'd been doing her own calculating for 4 days. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "you've been busy." "I have," she said. "Damaging the reputation of a man you don't know. Involving federal authorities in a private matter. Creating considerable inconvenience for associates of mine who had no involvement in anything that concerns you. If they're associated with you, they have involvement," she said. "That's how association works." Grayson's eyes moved to Cole. Something moved in his face that wasn't grief too old and too hardened for grief, but was something in the same country. "You killed my son," he said. Cole held his gaze and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Your son put a gun to a woman's head in a saloon in Red Rock. I stopped him. He was 23 years old. He was old enough to know what he was doing. He was my son." Grayson's voice hadn't risen. That was the most unsettling thing about it, the complete absence of escalation, the flatness that was worse than shouting, because it communicated that the emotion behind it had long since burned past the stage where it expressed itself in volume. "And you took him from me and walked away like it was nothing." "It wasn't nothing," Cole said. "It's never nothing. But the alternative was a dead woman, and I'd make the same choice again." The silence between the three of them had a physical quality like weather. "I want him, Mrs. Calloway," Grayson said, looking back at her. "That is the only thing I want. Step aside from this man, and I will leave your property alone. I will remove my influence from Pruitt's court, and I will ensure that your ranch is legally secured in your name without any further interference. Walk away from Cole Ryder, and everything you've lost in the last week gets repaired." Clara looked at him. She kept her expression exactly where she wanted it. "And Cole, that's between him and me." "No," she said. "It's not. Because you've made it my business. You forced a marriage, burned my barn, shot my hands, and sent men onto my property in the night. You made it my business 6 weeks ago when you put Pruitt in my courtroom." She took one step forward to the fence line. "I'm not stepping aside from anything. Cole Ryder is my husband, and he stays on my land and under my protection, and if you push this further, every newspaper in 5 territories runs the full story tomorrow morning. I've already written it. It's sitting in envelopes at 4 separate addresses, and the only thing keeping those envelopes sealed right now is whether or not you get back on your horse and ride out of my county." Grayson looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. "You're making an enemy," he said. "I have enemies," she said. "I'm still here." He turned his horse, rode away without another word, and Clara watched him go and felt the specific weight of a man who hasn't conceded, only retreated, and knew the difference. She turned to Cole. "He's not going to stop." "No," Cole said. His voice was flat and certain. "He's going to Red Canyon. The canyon south of the Henderson property. He'll want terrain advantage. He's a military man, or he was before the railroads. He thinks in terms of ground." Cole's jaw was tight. "He's going to send a messenger, and the message is going to be a direct challenge. Him and his men against me. Isolated. Away from your ranch, away from witnesses." "And you're going to go?" she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her. "If I go, he leaves you alone. If you go and he kills you, I'm alone with a burned barn and no resolution, and his men still in the county." She kept her voice level. "That's not a trade I'm accepting. Clara." His voice was steady, but there was something raw underneath it. "I've been running from this for 3 years. It ends here either way. I'd rather it end somewhere that doesn't put you and your ranch in the middle of the fire. Then we do it where I can control the variables," she said. "The marshals arrive in 48 hours. We need Grayson in one place for 48 hours. Cole looked at her. "You want to use me as bait. I want to use you as the thing that keeps him focused while the marshals arrive with enough authority to end this legally and permanently." She held his gaze. "You ride out to the canyon. Visible. You give him his confrontation. And I... No. Cole, absolutely not." His voice didn't raise, but the finality in it was so complete that it stopped her mid-sentence. You are not riding into a canyon with Harold Grayson's hired killers. Someone has to be there to signal the marshals when Grayson arrives. They need a position inside the canyon, not on the road. Send Pete. Pete is 63 years old. Then send Davis, or Davis has a wounded shoulder. She put both hands flat on the fence rail between them. Cole, look at me. He looked at her jaw set eyes hard, and she could see the argument building behind his face like weather, and she talked through it before it could arrive. I have been running this ranch since before Ethan died. I have been holding this land together with paperwork and willpower and sheer stubbornness for 6 weeks against a man with more money and more men than I have. I am not a woman who needs to be kept safe in the house while the dangerous work happens outside. I need you to know that about me. The silence stretched. I know that about you, he said. His voice had changed, still controlled, but the resistance in it had shifted into something more complicated. That's not what this is about. Then what is it about? He looked at her across the fence rail, and what she saw in his face in that moment was something she had not seen there before. Not the professional assessment, not the controlled distance, not even the almost smiles. This was unguarded in a way he hadn't been since the night in the kitchen, and it cost him something to leave it that open. She could see that plainly. I can't lose you, he said. Just that. Plain and direct, and with no architecture of explanation around it. I understand that I don't have the right to say that. I understand the ranch is yours, and the decisions are yours, and I don't get to put conditions on any of it. But I'm telling you the truth, because you asked me once to tell you what was true, and that is what's true. I cannot. He stopped. I cannot do this if you're in that canyon. The morning was cold and still around them. Clara looked at him for a long time. Then stay close to me, she said finally. That's all I'm asking. Stay close. His exhale was slow and controlled, and told her everything it was designed not to tell her. All right, he said. Marshal Reeves's men arrived 36 hours later, 6 deputies well armed, traveling under federal authority that superseded anything Pruitt's County Court could do about it. Clara met them at the road and briefed them with the focused precision of a woman who had been preparing this briefing in her head for 4 days. And the lead deputy, a lean, sharp-eyed man named Carver, who'd been doing this work for 15 years, listened without interrupting, and then looked at her and said, Ma'am, you've done about half our job for us. I need Grayson brought in legally, she said, alive and facing charges, not dead in a canyon. Dead men don't answer for things. Understood. Carver looked at Cole. Ryder, you ride out at dawn. Draw him to the canyon. We'll have men in position before you get there. He paused. You sure about this? Cole glanced at Clara. She's sure, he said. That's enough. Dawn came in cold and pale, and Cole saddled his horse in the gray light, while Clara stood at the barn door and watched and said nothing, because everything worth saying had been said the night before, and there was no point cluttering the morning with words that would only make the next few hours harder. He pulled himself up and looked down at her from the saddle. 2 hours, she said. If you're not out of that canyon in 2 hours, I'm coming in. You're staying with Carver's men on the ridge. 2 hours, she repeated. He held her gaze. Then he turned his horse and rode south toward the canyon, and Clara stood in the barn door and watched him go, and breathed through her nose and counted the seconds until she could move. She gave him 20 minutes. Then she saddled her own horse. Pete materialized at her stirrup with the specific expression of a man who has decided to stop being surprised. You told Carver you'd stay on the ridge, he said. I'm going to the ridge. She checked the rifle in its scabbard. I'm just going by way of the canyon. Lord have mercy, Pete said and stepped back. She rode hard for the canyon. She came in from the east approach the long way, the way Grayson wouldn't be watching because it added 20 minutes to the ride and required crossing the Henderson Creek twice. And she came in low and quiet, the way Cole had taught her, without realizing he was teaching her, not through instruction, but through example, through weeks of watching a man who who moved through dangerous terrain like he'd been built for it. She heard the shots before she cleared the canyon entrance. Not scattered shots, organized. Fire, the sound of men who knew what they were doing. Exchanging shots with men who also knew what they were doing. And underneath it, the particular crack of Marshal Carver's deputies coming in from the North Ridge, the way they'd planned. She came around the last turn into the canyon and took in the situation in the space of 2 seconds, the way you learn to do when there's no time for anything slower. Cole behind a boulder firing with controlled precision at 3 men positioned along the west wall. Carver's deputies pressing in from the north, scattering Grayson's hired guns. 2 men down on the canyon floor, neither of them Cole, neither of them in Marshall's colors, and Harold Grayson himself on foot, moving along the east wall, toward a position directly behind Cole's boulder. Cole didn't see him. He was focused on the west wall. He didn't see Grayson moving up his blind side with a rifle leveled and the expression of a man who has been waiting 3 years for this exact moment. Clara didn't think. She raised her rifle and she fired. The shot hit Grayson in the shoulder, not where she'd aimed, which was the rifle itself, but close enough. He went down. The rifle fell. He hit the canyon floor hard and stayed there, and the shot that he'd been about to put in Cole's back went into the canyon wall instead, and scattered rock dust over nothing. Cole spun, saw Grayson on the ground, saw Clara on horseback at the canyon entrance with the rifle still raised and smoke at the barrel. Everything stopped for about 3 seconds. Then Carver's men swept in, and the remaining gunfighters made the smart decision, and the canyon went from firefight to aftermath in the space of another 60 seconds. The way violence does, all that accumulated pressure, and then suddenly the pressure was gone. And what was left was just cold air and men breathing hard and the smell of gunpowder. Cole came across the canyon floor toward her at a pace that was not quite running, but was close, and she was dismounting when he got there, and his hands caught her arms as her feet found the ground, and she registered that she was shaking. Not from fear, the shaking had come after the way it always does, and she looked up at him and said, "I'm all right." "You're bleeding. She looked down. Her left side below the ribs, she hadn't felt it in the moment, which she'd heard happened, which she'd never quite believed until right now. A graze, she thought. She put her hand to it, and felt the wet and thought practically that needs attention. Then Cole's arm came around her, and he held her with a force that was not quite gentle and entirely necessary, and she leaned into him, because her legs had decided to make a point about the last 30 minutes, and she felt his breath against her hair, and heard something in his chest that wasn't quite a word. "Cole." Her voice was muffled against his shoulder. "Don't." His arms tightened. "Just don't move for a minute. It's a graze. I know." He was not crying. He was absolutely not crying, and she felt the slight shake in his arms that told her he was very close to it, and was applying the same controlled force to that as he applied to everything else, and something about that, the effort of it, the tightness of it, the fact that Cole Ryder could face down Harold Grayson's hired guns without his hands trembling, and was now holding her like she was the only solid thing in the world, broke open something in her chest that she was not going to examine right now, because now was still not the time. "I didn't survive all this," she said quietly into his shoulder, "just to lose you now." He made a sound then that she hadn't heard from him before. Not words. Just a sound low and rough, and his arms around her said everything that the sound couldn't carry. And Clara Calloway stood in a canyon in Wyoming, with a graze on her left side, and a man who had been afraid to want anything for 10 years holding on to her like she was the reason to stop being afraid. And she thought, this is what it feels like when something is real. Across the canyon, Deputy Carver clamped iron around Harold Grayson's wrists with the precise efficiency of a federal officer who has been doing a job and done it correctly. Grayson was pale from the shoulder wound and breathing hard and looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man calculating how long it will take to buy his way out of this and whether the number is still achievable. Carver looked over at Clara and Cole and nodded once, the nod of a man who has seen enough to know what he's looking at. He turned back to his prisoner and kept moving. The ride back from Red Canyon was the longest hour of Cole Ryder's life, and he had lived through some long hours. He kept his horse close to Clara's the entire way, close enough that their stirrups nearly touched, and he watched her with a peripheral attention so constant that it bordered on something he wasn't going to name out loud. The grays on her left side had been cleaned and bound by Deputy Carver's field medic before they left the canyon, competently done nothing. Life-threatening. The medic had said it with the professional calm of a man who'd seen considerably worse, and Cole had stood there and listened to those words and let them settle through him like water through cracked earth, slow and necessary, and not quite enough. Clara rode straight-backed and quiet, which he'd learned meant she was processing something large. He didn't push. He'd learned that too. It was when they turned onto the last stretch of road before the ranch that she said without looking at him, "You were going to let him shoot you." Cole kept his eyes on the road. "No. Cole, I didn't see him. You're the most situationally aware man I have ever met in my life. You track exits in a room before you sit down. You heard Mercer's riders at the south fence from inside the house in the middle of a storm." She finally turned her head and looked at him. "You didn't see a man with a rifle moving up your left side." He was quiet for long enough that the silence became an answer. "He had 3 years of grief driving him," Cole said finally. "He came a long way for it. I thought if I gave him the confrontation he needed with Carver's men in position." He stopped. "I thought the cleanest outcome was a situation where he got close enough to me that it felt like resolution to him, and Carver moved in before anything else happened. And if Carver hadn't moved in fast enough, then he would have gotten what he came for and the legal case against him would have closed, and you and the ranch would have been clear of it." Clara stopped her horse. He stopped his. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, which was unusual because he'd gotten considerably better at reading her over the past weeks. This one had too many things in it at once. Anger and something fiercer than anger, and underneath both of those, something raw and aching that she wasn't trying to hide, which meant either she'd decided he'd earned the right to see it, or she was too tired to manage the effort of concealing it. "If you had died in that canyon," she said, her voice very precise and very controlled, "to clean up a situation that Grayson created and Pruitt enabled and that I have been fighting for 6 weeks with every tool I have. Do you understand what that would have done to me?" He held her gaze. "I was trying to protect you. I know that." Her voice didn't waver. "I know exactly what you were trying to do. And I need you to understand clearly right now that your life is not a resource you get to spend on my behalf without my permission." She held the eye contact for another beat, making sure it landed. "We do this together, or we don't do it at all." That was what I said at the canyon entrance, and I meant it in both directions. Cole looked at her on that road in the morning light, with the cold Wyoming air around them, and the ranch visible in the distance, and thought, this woman is going to be the end of everything. I thought I understood about myself, and I cannot find a single thing about that to regret. "Understood," he said. "Good." She put her horse back in motion. "Now let's go home. I need to talk to Pete and send 3 telegraphs and change this bandage, and I want all of that done before noon." He fell back into step beside her, close enough that their stirrups nearly touched again, and he thought home. She said home. And she meant the ranch, which was her home, which was also, and this still arrived in him like something new each time he encountered it his. The days following Grayson's arrest moved fast in the way that consequential days do, packed tight with events that in ordinary times would have been spread across weeks. Deputy Carver and his men escorted Harold Grayson to Cheyenne, where federal charges were filed with a speed that suggested Marshal Reeves had been waiting for exactly this paperwork. Judge Pruitt was removed from the bench within 72 hours, not quietly and not gently, but with the efficiency of federal authority that had been handed everything it needed to act and had acted on it. The county woke up to a courthouse without Pruitt in it and spent approximately 48 hours being uncertain about what to feel about that before settling with the pragmatic flexibility that small communities have always applied to the powerful men they suddenly discover were not as untouchable as assumed, into a general consensus that they'd had concerns all along. Clara read about this consensus in the Clearwater Gazette over her morning coffee, and found it exactly as satisfying as she'd expected. which was not very because she was not a woman who needed the retrospective approval of people who'd been silent when their approval might have cost them something. She said as much to Cole, who said, "No," meaning he agreed with her and poured his own coffee, and she thought, "This is also a thing I've gotten used to. A man who says no when he means yes, and means it as complete agreement, and doesn't feel the need to expand on it." She'd gotten used to a lot of things. The railroad contracts came through 10 days after Grayson's arrest, which was either coincidence or the specific kind of consequence that follows when a man who has been artificially suppressing competing land claims is removed from the equation. Clara signed 3 separate agreements that secured the Callaway water rights across Clearwater Creek as a primary supply point for the Northern Rail expansion, at terms that made Pete, when she showed him the numbers, sit down heavily in his chair and say, "Lord have mercy," for the second time in 2 weeks. "The ranch is going to need expansion," Clara said, spreading the contract across the kitchen table. "We'll need 2 more hands by spring, possibly 3. The east barn needs to be rebuilt properly, not just patched. And I want to look at the Henderson property old Dan's been wanting to sell for 2 years, and the access it would give us to the North Water table." "Clara." Cole said her name from across the table, in a tone she'd learned to recognize as the one that meant he was about to say something he'd been sitting on for a while. She looked up. He had both hands flat on the table, and he was looking at her with that particular expression, the direct, unguarded one, the one that cost him something, and she felt the slight shift in her chest that she'd also gotten used to and had stopped pretending wasn't there. "The contracts are good," he said. "The expansion makes sense. The Henderson property is a smart acquisition." A pause. "But that's not what you were up all night thinking about." She held his gaze. "Isn't it?" "No." He waited. Clara set down her pen. Outside the kitchen window, the ranch moved through its morning hands crossing the yard, horses shifting in their rebuilt stalls, Pete directing the refencing project on the south perimeter with the absorbed authority of a man who has been waiting for something useful to do. All of it hers, all of it against a series of odds she was still calculating intact. "The marriage," she said. "Yes," he said. "It was performed under duress by a judge who has since been removed for corruption." She chose each word carefully. "Legally, there's an argument that it was never valid." Cole didn't move. "Is that what you want?" "I'm telling you what's true legally. I'm not telling you what I want." She kept her eyes on his. "I'm asking you. What do you want?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she could hear the wind off the pasture and Pete's voice giving instructions in the yard and the distant sound of hammers on the new barn frame. Then he said, "I want to stay on this ranch. I want to work this land with you. I want to be the thing standing between you and whatever comes next, not because a judge ordered it, but because—" He stopped. The jaw shifted. "Because there is nowhere else I want to be. There is nothing else I want to be." He met her eyes directly with no architecture of protection around what was in them. "But if what happened in that courtroom isn't what you want as the foundation of it, then I'd rather we build it again from something you chose freely, even if what we build is the same thing." Clara looked at him across the kitchen table. The morning moved around them. "Give me 2 weeks," she said. He nodded once and picked up his coffee and let it rest there, complete the way he let most things rest when they'd been said clearly enough. It was the longest 2 weeks of his life. He did not waste them. He never wasted work time. It wasn't in his construction, but he was aware of them, in the way you're aware of a wound healing constantly just below the surface, with a tenderness that you don't press on but can't quite forget. He rebuilt fence. He negotiated with the lumber supplier about the east barn materials. He spent 3 days in the north pasture assessing the water table access that the Henderson contract would open up, and came back with a survey that made Clara look at him and say, "You can read a water survey." And he said, "Among other things." And she shook her head slowly in the way that meant she was recalibrating again, which he'd noticed she did periodically, and which he found privately the most satisfying thing in the world. The town's attitude turned during those 2 weeks, in the way small-town attitudes do, not all at once, and not with any particular grace, but in the incremental face-saving way of people who are repositioning a held opinion without quite admitting they're doing it. Herbert Crane at the feed store started meeting Clara's eyes again. Samuel Briggs at the bank delivered an apology so convoluted and carefully worded that Clara had to concentrate hard to extract the actual apology from the surrounding qualifications. But it was in there. Even Margaret Howell stopped her wagon on Main Street and said with the specific awkwardness of a woman who gossips as naturally as breathing and has just been confronted with the consequences of it. "I want you to know I never believed what Mercer was saying." "Not really." Clara looked at her pleasantly and said, "I know, Margaret." Which was not entirely true, but was generous enough to let the woman sleep at night and drove on. It was Pete who told her about the change that mattered most. "3 of Mercer's ranch hands came to me," Pete said in the careful voice he used for news he was unsure how she'd receive. "Looking for work. Mercer's operation is contracting. He's lost 2 land leases since Pruitt went, and word is he's having trouble getting credit." Pete paused. "They said in town people are calling Cole the man who held the valley together." Clara absorbed this. "What did you tell the hands?" "That I'd ask you. Tell them to come Monday. I'll talk to them." She looked out at the yard where Cole was working with the lumber delivery moving boards with the efficient, unhurried strength she'd watched for weeks. "Pete?" "Ma'am." "Go find Reverend Aldous. Tell him I'd like to speak with him." Pete was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, ma'am," in a voice that held a very precisely managed amount of satisfaction. She didn't tell Cole what she was planning. She told Pete, who told no one, because Pete had the discipline of a man who understood that some things earned their moment by arriving unannounced. She told young Davis, whose shoulder had healed cleanly, and who agreed to the role she gave him with an enthusiasm that he worked hard to contain. She wrote to 2 women in town, not the ones who'd been kind to her out of social obligation, but the ones who'd been actually specifically kind in the weeks after Ethan died, when kindness had a cost, and both of them agreed immediately and without conditions. She ordered the dress from a seamstress in Cheyenne. Not elaborate, she was not an elaborate woman, and never had been, but made from fabric the color of the late afternoon sky over Wyoming, which was neither blue nor gray, but something exactly between them that didn't have a clean name, but that she'd loved since the first winter she'd spent on this land. On a Saturday morning in early spring, with the grass just beginning its first pale green push through the brown winter ground, and the sky doing exactly what she'd been counting on it to do. With the light, Clara Calloway put on the dress and walked out to the yard where every ranch hand was gathered. Her hands and Davis and Pete standing slightly apart with his hat in his hand, and his weathered face arranged into something that was not crying and was not crying either, and where Reverend Aldous stood with his book, and where Cole Ryder stood with his back to her, apparently in conversation with Tom Brierly about something to do with the north fence. Davis cleared his throat. Cole turned around. He looked at her the way she'd known he would, that complete unguarded attention, but stripped now of every layer of professional control, every carefully maintained distance, every managed expression. Just the thing itself, plain and undisguised, and it was more than she'd been entirely prepared for, which was a feeling she filed away with some satisfaction, because she hadn't expected to be surprised by him anymore, and it turned out she hadn't been wrong to leave that possibility open. She walked toward him through the gathered hands and the spring morning, and the light that was doing exactly what Wyoming light does when it's trying, and she stopped in front of him and looked up at him and said in a voice clear enough that everyone in the yard could hear, "The first time I stood in a courtroom and said words because a corrupt judge with a bought agenda told me I had no choice. I said them because the ranch needed protecting, and you were the protection available, and I was out of options." She held his gaze. "That's the truth, and I'm not going to dress it up into something it wasn't." He looked at her steadily and said nothing, which was exactly right. "This time," she said, "I'm standing in my yard on my land in front of every person I trust, and I am telling you plainly in front of all of them that I choose you. Not because of what you can protect me from, not because of what you can do for this ranch." Her voice didn't waver. "Because you are the most honest person I have ever known. Because you kept every promise you made me, including the hard ones. Because you walked back out into a rainstorm when you could have stayed, and you followed my lead when most men wouldn't have, and you held on to me in a canyon like I was the only solid thing left in the world, and I..." She stopped for exactly one beat. I felt the same way. The yard was absolutely silent. Cole looked at her, and something in his face was doing something she had never seen it do. Not the almost smile, not the controlled stillness, not the managed distance. Something was simply open in him, in a way that a thing opens when it's been shut for a very long time, and the thing holding it shut has finally let go. His voice when he spoke was not entirely level, and she was fiercely glad of that. "You're sure?" he said. "Cole." She almost smiled. "When have I ever done anything I wasn't sure of?" The sound that came out of him then was not quite a laugh, and not quite anything else, and she thought she would remember the specific quality of it for the rest of her life. Reverend Aldous opened his book. The second ceremony was nothing like the first, where the first had been performed in a courtroom, smelling of pine resin and old tobacco, in front of witnesses she hadn't chosen, under the supervision of a judge who'd been paid for the outcome. This one was in a yard full of people who knew her, in the light she'd chosen on purpose, with words she said because she meant them, and not because a legal mechanism required them. When Aldous reached the question, and she said yes, she said it looking directly at Cole. And when Cole said yes, he said it the same way, not to the Reverend, not to the assembled witnesses, but directly to her, with the specific weight of a man making a promise he intends to keep, if it kills him, which she now knew to be the only kind of promise he made. When it was over, and Aldous closed his book, and the hands broke into the kind of noise that men make when they've been holding back feeling for the duration of a ceremony, and are finally released from the obligation of restraint. Cole looked at her for one more moment, and then he kissed her. And this was nothing like the first kiss either, which had been unexpected and charged and slightly desperate the way things are when they've been held back too long. This one was deliberate. This one was chosen. This one was the kind of kiss that says, "This is where I am, and this is where I intend to stay. And I am not afraid of that anymore." Pete made a sound that was definitely not crying from somewhere behind her left shoulder. She ignored it because Pete had earned the right to his moment, and because she was occupied. The spring moved through its weeks, the way spring does when everything is finally aligned, full of work and noise, and the particular exhaustion that comes from doing the things you love, past the point where you thought you were capable. The east barn went up clean and solid, better than the original. 3 new hands joined the operation, including 2 of Mercer's former men, who turned out to be reliable and hard-working, and who seemed to feel in the way that people feel things they don't articulate, that they were working toward something worth working toward. The railroad contracts delivered on their promise, and the numbers that the accountant in Cheyenne put in front of Clara on a morning in April made her sit back in her chair and look at them for a long time without speaking. She sent the accountant away and brought the papers home and put them on the kitchen table and sat across from Cole and slid them toward him without comment. He looked at them, looked at her. "The Henderson purchase," he said. "We can make the offer this week. And the additional water infrastructure on the North Line, in the budget." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You built this." "We built this." She tapped the papers. "Your survey of the North Pasture is what made the railroad terms possible. They needed the water access confirmed before they'd commit to those rates. That was 2 days of riding the line. That was 2 days of riding the line that turned into a contract that secured this ranch for the next 20 years. She held his gaze. "Don't minimize what you brought to this." He looked at her with that open expression she still wasn't entirely used to, even weeks into having permission to look at it directly. "I'm not used to that," he said. "To what may someone telling me what I contributed, counting it." Clara looked at him across the table. This man who had spent 10 years making himself small enough not to lose anything, who had come to her ranch with nothing except a reputation and a promise, and had kept the promise exactly as stated. And she thought about everything it had taken to get to this kitchen table this morning, this particular quality of ordinary that felt after everything like the rarest thing in the world. "Get used to it," she said. He almost smiled. She counted it fully. Wade Mercer left Clearwater County in May, quietly. Without announcement, his operation reduced by half, and his standing in the community reduced further than that. No one made a speech about it. No one needed to. The county land records reflected the reallocation of his contested leases with the neutral efficiency of paperwork, and the space he'd occupied in the town's social architecture closed over behind him the way water closes over a stone. Clara heard about his departure from Pete and said nothing except "good," and went back to her account ledgers. Harold Grayson stood trial in federal court in Cheyenne that summer. The charges included corruption, coercion, conspiracy to commit fraud, and the illegal suppression of multiple land claims across 4 territories. Clara provided testimony by written deposition, precise and detailed and devastating in the way that precision is devastating when it's pointed at something that cannot survive exposure to daylight. 3 other witnesses, who had previously been unavailable, became available once Grayson's capacity to make them otherwise was removed. He was convicted on all counts. She read the verdict in the Cheyenne Daily Leader at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, and folded the paper and set it aside, and drank her coffee, and felt the specific quality of an ending, not triumphant, not relieved exactly, but settled. The way a door feels when it closes properly on a room you've finished with. Cole was in the yard. She could hear him through the window talking to Tom Brierly about the North Fence project, his voice carrying the particular note it had when he was working through a practical problem-focused spare direct. She listened to it for a moment. Then she got up and went out to tell him. He read the headline she handed him and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he folded the paper carefully and gave it back to her and said, "It's over." "Yes," she said. He looked out at the ranch, at the rebuilt barn, and the new fence line, and the pasture running green all the way to where the sky came down. And she watched him look at it, and she knew he was doing what she'd been doing since that Tuesday morning, with the coffee, learning slowly and carefully how to live inside an ordinary day, when the thing you'd been braced against was finally gone. "What do you want to do today?" she said. He looked at her. The question plainly hadn't been what he was expecting, but that was the thing about ordinary days. They required ordinary answers, and Cole Ryder was for the first time in a decade in a position to give one. "The north fence needs another day," he said, "and Pete mentioned the irrigation channel on the east side has been running slow." "All right," she said. "I have the Henderson closing papers to review this afternoon and a letter to send to the rail office in Cheyenne. I'll have Tom start on the channel." She nodded, turned toward the house. Then she stopped and turned back, because there was something she'd been meaning to say since that morning in April, when they'd looked at the contracts together, and she'd watched him take in the numbers with the expression of a man who has just for the first time understood that something good is going to last. "Cole." He looked at her. "You stopped running," she said. "You stopped 3 years ago in a saloon in Red Rock when you did the right thing, and you stopped again when you rode into this town and agreed to stand between me and something I couldn't have handled alone, and you haven't run once since." She held his gaze. "I want you to know that I see that. I see what it costs, and I'm—" She paused, choosing the word with care. "I'm glad you stopped here." He stood in the yard of the Calloway Ranch in the morning light with the rebuilt barn behind him and the spring grass running all the way to the horizon, and he looked at the woman who had put her hand on his face in a rainstorm and kissed him without asking permission, and shot a man off his blind side in a canyon, and married him twice, once because she had no choice, and once because she did, and the hardened, scarred, long-running man who had spent 10 years making sure he had nothing to lose, looked at her and said, "I'm not going anywhere." And that was the whole truth of it, not a promise built from obligation or desperation, or the impossible mathematics of a forced courtroom arrangement, but the simple, definitive statement of a man who had found the one place in the world where staying was worth more than everything that running had ever given him. The dangerous outlaw had not destroyed the sheriff's widow. He had stayed, and she had stayed, and together they had built something out of forced circumstances and hard honesty, and 2 people stubborn enough to keep choosing each other past every reason not to. And that thing they built held the way things hold when they're made from what's real, and it was more than enough. And it was theirs, and it would last.